Thank you, Dr. Waller. So before we begin, I just want to briefly touch on how this is going to go. We're going to have Dr. Flaim present, and then after which we will open it up to questions. If you have a question but you don't feel comfortable saying it out loud, you can put it in the chat box and I'll read it for you. But if you'd like to speak over Zoom, you can raise your hand using the raise your hand button. But with that, it is my pleasure to announce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Amanda Flaim, who is associated with Michigan State University at James Madison College, the Department of Sociology, and the Center for Gender and Global Context. Dr. Flaim is a political sociologist who studies human rights policy and development programs in mainland Southeast Asia. Specifically, she researches indigenous and ethnic minority communities in upland Thailand, examining how their vulnerability affects health outcomes, educational attainment, population movements, and land use and land claims. Dr. Flaim is currently collaborating with fellow MSU and James Madison College faculty and students, as well as artists, activists, UNESCO, and leading faculty partners in Southeast Asia, to explore the possibilities for less damaging environmental policies along the imperiled Mekong River and its tributaries. And as Dr. Waller said, this session is held in association with the Great Decisions Program of Foreign Policy Association. Welcome, Amanda Flaim.
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for that generous and very thorough introduction, and another public and recorded thank you to Marianne and John for inviting me, and for everyone for making time for this conversation, which I want to emphasize hopefully can really be a conversation. I don't know if I'm violating protocol by testing something here. Is it possible for us in the chat to quick test the chat so I'll make sure I can see it and everybody write a greeting into the chat so I can see it? If it's alive, we can test that first. So if you can't, just to make sure everybody knows how to use it, if you, okay, see some people are coming to life here. Thank you for writing in here. If you don't see it, there's an icon at the bottom of the screen that says chat. And if you click on that, it should open it for you and you can type in there. And then the other thing gosh, I'm not teaching this semester. Let me see, test my own. Oh yeah, so the other one should be an icon under reactions, which I welcome anytime through the presentation. Unfortunately, you know, if you use the reactions, it tends to, thank you, there's good examples. You can't really give a thumbs down. They don't give that as an option. But you're welcome to do it publicly if you like. You can also raise your hand there, and I'm very happy to take questions as I move through this. Is there anything else? Yeah, okay. And I just want to say that what I'm going to talk to you about today is actually not something I've ever presented in any other forum. I've presented about my research related to risk of exploitation, disproportionate kinds of risk that indigenous communities face to particular kinds of human trafficking and exploitation. But the talk that I'm giving you today is perhaps in an effort to get to know you and for you to get to know me, is a little bit more of giving you a framework of how I got to the point where I'm doing the work that I am in relationship to kind of resource contestations over resources and kind of broader, maybe bigger infrastructural projects in the Mekong region. So if anything that I'm kind of going to cover a lot of time here, I'm going to draw from my experiences in different field sites to talk about the kind of politics of human trafficking work as it pertains to kind of the broader narratives, global narratives about human trafficking and how it actually plays out in various places in the field. And then I'm very happy should this conversation turn to questions of more local concerns. I haven't done any particular field work in Michigan, but I'm pretty aware of how certain groups are engaging in questions of trafficking prevention and issues of exploitation. So I really invite you to ask questions as you're interested, and certainly to ask me for any clarifications as I move. Okay, let's share screen here. Okay, So most of, can everybody see this? All right, and I'm going to just open my chat again. So I have your faces on my screen, and I have the chat up here, so I can't really see my own my own presentation, but hopefully what I'm saying jives with the images. Most of the images that I'm going to show you are images that I've taken in fieldwork. I will make a note of when that is not the case. And in this particular instance, I didn't take this picture, and it's for reasons that a research partner of mine did, who is male. Right, so the image here is, and before I move through here, I just want to also note that the images I'm going to show you, some of these images are going to resonate with you if you're interested in or follow questions of human trafficking and exploitation. Some of these images will kind of resonate with you around how trafficking and exploitation is portrayed. And I want us to attend to both the image as it represents trafficking or instances of human exploitation, but also the kind of political work that it does to promote ideas of what trafficking is or is not. Right, so in this particular instance, these are Burmese and Cambodian men and boys, not young children, for reasons I can explain later, but legally under the age of 18, probably 16, 17, 18 years old, on a Thai fishing boat. And it was taken by a research partner of mine for a publication that I'll explain in a bit. Okay. All right, so here's my plan. I'm not going to give Liam Neeson too much play here. Some of you may or may not be familiar with this pretty critically panned film from 2008. Liam Neeson is out to rescue his American daughter who's partying in Paris and then is sent into a sort of dubiously defined and certainly Orientalist in its portrayal Middle Eastern sex trafficking ring. And this is this kind of imagery and the role of Westerners in dealing with and addressing trafficking is something I'm putting in here on purpose. It's not about the kind of work that I do, but it informs the politics of how people tend to think about trafficking and who's at risk. So the plan here, we're not going to be rescuing anybody at gunpoint, nor should we be. But what we are going to do is go through, what is trafficking? How is it defined? How does my work inform basically what it is I'm going to talk to you about? And I don't normally spend so much time on sort of talking about a personal journey through research, but I don't know how to talk to you about the kind of conclusions I'm going to come to without taking you through a bit of my work as in becoming a scholar on the issue. I'm also introducing a bit of cringe. Chris, that's for you, as the youth say, because this is also going to be a bit of a, I'm going to be honest here about what I thought I was doing when I started work on trafficking and kind of what fieldwork engagements and encounters have led me to understand about those beliefs. And particularly, we're going to talk about, and I invite questions about particular fieldwork in Cambodia, in West Africa broadly through the cocoa production in Benin and Togo, Thailand in particular. So Thailand is I'm most engaged in contexts across Thailand. Thailand is extremely diverse. So 2 contexts in Thailand, that's where I tend to do most of my sustained field work, but also as my work in Nepal also informs this. So I'll take you through that. Okay, before I move forward, checking the chat here, making sure we don't have any questions. All right, I'm going to say trafficking ill-defined. So it is 2021. This is 21 years since the Palermo Protocol, which is a protocol that has in 2000 was signed by member states parties to the United Nations in an effort to recognize human trafficking as a problem and then collaborate and through international policing systems essentially to address it. And this is it's a very long protocol that offers very slippery definitions that continue to be meted out both politically and legally, but by kind of general definition, there are 3 components of human trafficking as it's defined. So you have to have a movement across a border, right? And that movement has to be exercised by coercion or deception, broadly, fraud, coercion, deception, force, with the exception of children. So you don't have to show force or deception. If you move a child across the border and they willingly go, that could still be trafficking, but it has to be for the purpose of exploitation. Okay. And as we go through these field sites, you might see how some of this starts to fall apart a little bit. I'm also showing you an image that a friend of mine shared. In 2000, I was a college senior, so I was not in Palermo, Italy, signing this protocol, but I, through colleagues, know people who were there, some people who were drafting it. These are images just to remind us, right, that these international protocols that define a problem and mobilize millions and sometimes billions of dollars of resources to address an issue are produced. These protocols are produced in pretty banal social spaces by very well-intentioned, but narrowly defined, experts. So most of the people in this room are lawyers thinking about trafficking. Most of them are also members, nationals of a country in the global north, broadly defined, states that benefited from history of colonialism. And so not necessarily always representing communities, as I'll explain, who are disproportionately at risk of certain kinds of trafficking. Okay, so the field sites that I'm going to draw from, I'm actually going to show you how I came to start working on this issue and in what context. So in 2001 and 2002, I was spending most of my time in China. I was mostly avoiding law school. I had graduated undergrad and I moved to China to avoid questions about what I was going to do for my future, and ended up in this city that's one of the world's most productive special economic zones. So this is where an area called Shenzhen, China, which in 1978, the year I was born, was a fishing village. And over the course of the last 40 years has now a population of some tens of millions of people, all of whom essentially live in very narrowly circumscribed and highly surveilled working conditions. And I went there as an English teacher, having no idea that my students were the children of workers in these kinds of factories now where your socks are made. There's a sock city in this area, right? And I took a Chinese New Year holiday to Cambodia. And at the time, so this is basically at a time in which a woman named Somali Mom, who is a fairly well-known personality in global anti-trafficking movements. She was being highlighted by a New York Times journalist and editorialist who was highlighting her struggle in stopping human trafficking in her own communities. And this really got me excited and inspired about issues of human trafficking prevention. And a lot of her journey, her particular relationship to trafficking was about not only labor exploitation, but also sexual exploitation. And so she became popular in the West as a figure whose narrative really resonated with people who thought, well, this is absolutely unsustainable. It's completely indefensible, exploiting people for any purpose, but particularly for sex, and young people and children, right? This is indefensible and people want to act on this. I'm going to come back to this in a bit about how this story starts to unravel, but I went to Cambodia and I volunteered at a site that was loosely affiliated with this program. And a lot of the children at the time had been trafficked to Bangkok for begging. This was no longer an issue, but at the time that had been part of a problem. Then in 2005, I moved to Italy to work at their research headquarters for UNICEF on this project looking at the disproportionate risk of youth. So this is interesting, right? The imagery that you see here, this is not my picture, obviously, of babies, right? The notion of babies being highlighted in photography on trafficking and trafficking risk. They're not at risk of trafficking in this particular instance. In West Africa, it's stronger, more developed teens and youth who can work long hours in a field. Some people are very young, but disproportionately it's children who are teenagers working in cocoa fields. It's the only field site that I worked on from a distance. In the other places I spent more time. So from there, I actually worked at this anti-trafficking center at UNESCO and working in Thailand in the wake of the tsunami. And I'm highlighting an image here of somebody who just simply deserves all of the credit for most of the insights that I have. This is a research partner and interlocutor who I work with closely. Miju Morleku is basically like the Martin Luther King of the indigenous Highland peoples movement in Thailand for decades, many of them born and raised in Thailand for generations, and decades they've been denied their citizenship and rights to citizenship. And she would put herself from the 1990s through the early 2000s at mortal danger in order to advocate for Highlanders. And at the time that we were doing this project at UNESCO, Highlander communities, this is at a point where she's able to speak. This is a picture I took after a panel we were on together. She's able to speak about this issue in public on TV. And she's mobilizing political imagery in a very conscious way. She does not, when she's in Bangkok, she doesn't wear this outfit down the street. She's wearing this outfit at a public panel, the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand, speaking about the risk that Highland women and girls in particular they're at risk of trafficking because, she says, they don't have citizenship. It's not that they have any cultural proclivities to sell their daughters or sell each other into sex work. She's like, the problem we have is that our citizenship isn't recognized. And she's doing this very self-consciously in her self-presentation as an indigenous person, but speaking perfect Thai. And she's the one who sort of sat me down and said, Amanda, I can see you mean very well. And your ideas about what is informing trafficking and trafficking risk isn't entirely informed by deep field related insights. So she encouraged me to go get my PhD, whereupon I had to go back to New York. I went to Cornell to learn Thai and I still do most of my work, most of my field work in Thailand. And a lot of my work, as Chris was relaying at the beginning, deals with statelessness. I really shifted a lot of my research away from this concern around trafficking for a number of reasons that, again, I'll come back to, and move to a question of statelessness as a root cause of risk to trafficking. While I was doing my PhD at Cornell, I left for a year. I left my PhD and I worked for UNHCR in Nepal, leading a national survey of statelessness for them. But again, in this context, right, Nepal being situated in a particular global economy in which people are seeking recognition of their citizenship, not necessarily because they have any particular, it depends on the community, but they had any particular desire to vote, or because they wanted to exercise citizenship in the way that Western communities tend to imagine the importance of citizenship. For many Nepalese people, the reason they want to have their citizenship recognized in this particular moment is because they're seeking work outside of the country. And the only way you can travel is to get a passport. And if you travel without your passport, you got it, right? You become more at risk of exploitation. So moving from there, I was doing my postdoc at Duke and at the Center for Human Rights, and started partnering on a related project specifically on human trafficking in southern Thailand, looking at risk of trafficking and exploitation that is experienced by Burmese and Cambodian men and boys in the Thai fishing industry. And so all of these field sites, as I've moved through sort of attempting honest scholarly attempt to understand the issues that I am engaging in the places where I'm working, my relationship to questions of trafficking is also changing. And this informs a bit where I am in the kind of work I've been presenting at conferences more recently, which is actually kind of doing a more meta-analysis of how Westerners in particular imagine trafficking, and the kinds of the political economy in which our imaginings of human trafficking inform policy, inform particular kinds of political action. And this image at the top is a very kind of typical, it's very representative of a lot of anti-human trafficking agendas that are often global. It gives you a faceless, I want you to, again, think about these images doing a particular kind of political work. But this is often, right, this kind of imagery, or an image, of a child in chains or an image of someone in a box, often black and white, right? It gives you this sense of total vulnerability and desperation. From the time of Taken, right, Palermo Protocol, the movie Taken happens in 2008 until about 2015, we have a kind of global awakening and acknowledging that very little is actually known about human trafficking because of the lack of our capacity to say anything definitively about a phenomenon that happens very much in clandestine ways. So increasingly, I'm seeing this shift in the ways that nonprofit organizations and anti-trafficking organizations are showing us like kind of glossy images of children and mostly women enacting a kind of agency, which is something I'm going to come to towards the end. It's a really interesting and I think significant shift. All right, so what I thought I knew, I told you I was going to give us a little cringe. I really started where I think a lot of people start, right? That trafficking can happen to anyone. We are all at risk. We all must be vigilant. Trafficking is modern slavery. Sex trafficking is the problem. Women and children are most vulnerable, and trafficking is a cultural problem. There I am, right? I was like imagining myself, men Flaim to the rescue. All right, I told you it would be cringe. It's cringe in many ways here. And then I really thought, right, if I want to, like, looking back at this idea, right, if trafficking can happen to anyone, we're all at risk. So think about the logics of what this kind of belief system does for ideas about how we act. What does this instigate in terms of particular kinds of actions and obligations? It can happen to anyone. It's slavery. Sex trafficking is the problem. Trafficking is a cultural problem. Then if it's this vague, generalized risk, then anyone can act, right? And in truth, like trafficking, I work with a colleague who is one of my mentors and was on my dissertation committee. And he said, the domains of human trafficking tend to be where very intelligent people sort of lose critical faculties, right? We sort of want so desperately to believe that, not because we want to believe that people are bad and doing bad things, but when a problem is presented in such a way that people are subjected to, objectively horrible kinds of vulnerabilities, then it does sort of produce a kind of fervor in which people become very well-intentioned and want to help, but there's nowhere to anchor your help, right? So, all right, so what have the field sites taught me? This is where I'm going towards the end. And also, Chris, can you keep me on tell me when do I have like 10 minutes? Is that about right?
Dr. Waller, when did you want to get out?
No, I mean, normally the presentation will go to about, I don't know, we could go to 5:50, so another 20 if you wish.
I'm hoping. It's hard to see. Can't see where people are. Oh, I see faces. All right. Hopefully I'm not losing anybody, but I'm hoping to keep it to 10 if that's all right, and then we have more time for Q&A, but it might go slightly over. I'll try to keep this. Okay. So trafficking can happen to anyone. Well, deep hanging out ethnographies and survey work has taught me that trafficking is racialized and gendered. So I'm not saying it's racist, I'm saying it's racialized. I'm not saying it's sexist, I'm saying it's gendered. So I'll talk about what that means. Trafficking is modern slavery. It's a very effective political move to call something slavery, right? But I'm gonna talk about why it's not only an issue in terms of kind of questioning how we frame something in a framework of political correctness, it's also inaccurate, right? So as scholars, our job is to be as analytically accurate as possible and to talk about trafficking, which is a pretty broad and varied phenomenon, as slavery, is inaccurate. Sex trafficking is actually rarely the problem. I will give you some stories about this. I'm not saying, I want to be very clear. I am not saying on a recording on the internet to people who don't know me that sex trafficking is not a problem. Trafficking people for sex is a problem, period. If it's one person, it's a problem. Okay, does everybody follow me on that? But what I'm saying is that the way that in a political economy of kind of the white savior industrial complex, that we imagine human trafficking to be entirely related to sex trafficking there is not evidence that supports that, right? That in the proportion of the issue of human trafficking, proportionally speaking, sex trafficking, albeit a significant problem, is not a significant proportion of the problem. Dr. Weller, did I say that? Is that clear? Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. Women and children are particularly at risk. I'm going to talk about how and why this particular view does a disservice actually to, not only is it not always correct, it actually does a disservice to men and boys. So we have to think about, right? And it also does a disservice to women and girls for reasons I'm going to talk about. So this idea that trafficking is a cultural problem, this remains extremely prevalent. So when I come to this, I'll explain to you how mobilization of the ideas, often Orientalist ideas about particular communities that experience disproportionate risk of trafficking and exploitation, that somehow they are culturally predisposed to this, is again, not simply that it is not PC, it's inaccurate, right? It's a political ecological problem, and I'll explain how this framework can help us understand this. Anyone can and should help. Okay, this is a kind of controversial take. I'm curious how people feel about this. I think that coming to this question from a political ecology lens helps us to understand how everyone is implicated in issues of human exploitation, and therefore everyone can and should help, but not always in the way that it is framed. Are we hanging in? Okay. All right, I'm not going to hit all of these equally in terms of depth, but, and I know that you can't really see this image. I actually don't intend for you to read it in seriousness, because it's kind of baloney. Am I denigrating baloney here? I'm not sure. If there are big baloney eaters here, I apologize. Okay, so trafficking is not always slavery. Mobilizing the term of slavery is extremely effective. You can Google like human trafficking, slavery, modern day slavery. It gives you hundreds of thousands of hits. People are making all of these beautiful infographics, right, about how it is modern slavery. What I want to be clear about, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, is that slavery, by definition, right, slavery is a form of human trafficking, but not all trafficking is slavery. And scholars who are far more intelligent than I, working on, histories of the transatlantic slave trade, right, talk about how when we collapse all trafficking with slavery, then we also diminish our understandings of the particular forms of enslavement that occur in a kind of institution, a political economic institution in which people are bred like animals, right, to produce new forms of labor for a particular community or set of agents who will gain, capital and power from that. So there is very little evidence that people who are trafficked in the 21st century for labor exploitation or even sexual exploitation are being trafficked for the purpose of like breeding like animals, right? So to collapse that is not simply to be, again, to offend communities of color, Black and Afro-diasporic peoples in particular, right? But it's also inaccurate. And so we need to be critical consumers of trafficking information and understand that that's doing a very particular and very profitable form of work in a political economy of aid and development. Okay, so trafficking risk is racialized and gendered. So what I mean to say about this, right, when we see Liam Neeson storming down the streets of Paris, he's, an American man, he's a white man. This is really important, right? The gendered and racial dimensions of that particular image and idea circulate in a popular culture for very particular and powerful purposes. And the truth is, right, that let's think about this logically. I'm not normally encouraging my audience to imagine themselves as human traffickers, but why in your right mind would you go after a wealthy white daughter who is, who has an American passport, right? In particular context, it doesn't mean that white women and white American women are not ever at risk of human trafficking. There are contexts, of course, being homeless or being housing insecure, youth who are, who run away from home, et cetera. It puts people in a particular context at particular risk. But traveling internationally does not necessarily make you at risk of trafficking. And to the extent that it is racialized is to say that particular groups and disproportionately communities of color in the global north and entire societies in the global south that are situated in the global political economy at the bottom of supply chains are at risk of exploitation. Does that follow? Okay, so it's racialized to the extent that our global history of, global economic history is racialized. Particular communities of color in particular sites are at particular risk. And Thailand is a unique case for this very reason, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A. And it's gendered. So what's really important here in the case of China, right? So this is China. It has special economic zones. There are, in fact, some cultural norms and particular political economic norms in a global economy, which say young women in particular, ideas that young women in particular will work more diligently, they obey better than men. I'm not saying this is true, but these are the kinds of ideas that inform why we see disproportionately feminized labor in factories around the world, in factory work around the world that tends to be very feminized. Similarly, kind of sexist ideas inform why we might see men and boys at risk of particular kinds of trafficking in the fishing industry, right? So not all trafficking forms of labor, because labor is gendered, right? Labor is also racialized. Certain kinds of trafficking tend to put particular gender groups and racial groups at disproportionate risk or not. So, and in this case, the reason why this image isn't mine, I was doing research, I was in the field actually interviewing, mobilizing a particular kind of national and white privilege to do interviews with the people who own those boats. My research partners, being Thai men, could access the boats because one, they can move in through those spaces without being conspicuous in the way that I am. But also women are not allowed on the boats. It brings bad luck, apparently. This is the belief system. So I would be barred from doing a kind of ethnographic work in this. I'm going to move on, but I'm happy to answer questions if you have them. Okay, sex trafficking is rare. What I'm going to tell you, right, is two things. The image on the left, again, is Miju. She's explaining the particular risk that Highland women were experiencing with respect to sex trafficking. It was a problem in the 1990s in particular. But she was saying it's not because we sell our daughters. No one is selling their daughters. It's because they don't have citizenship. And when women and girls would be traveling from home, their villages were being, so Highland people, this is the short version, Highland communities can't own any land. Most of them have mobilized for citizenship. Their citizenship is increasingly recognized, but the government bars them. They live in the national forest. They're not allowed to own any of their land. So as their livelihoods are being decimated with the encroachment of the state and development entities, their local livelihoods are being decimated, and women and girls are moving into the cities looking for more work. Thailand is experiencing, this extraordinary economic boom from the 1980s through the, increasingly even now. And because it's situated in the global political economy with vast factories, they're searching for female labor, for a feminized labor force. But if you don't speak the national language, if you have, not attained high levels of education, and if you don't have an internal passport, it is very easy to exploit you. And so, whereas Highland indigenous women and girls, you will never encounter a Highland indigenous woman or girl. Well, I shouldn't say this never now, but in the 1990s and early 2000s, Highland women and girls were not in Patpong or these infamous, notorious, sex tourism zones. They were disproportionately in extremely exploitative kinds of situations where they couldn't escape. So, and increasingly, so I was interviewing a lot of folks on statelessness and how they experience statelessness, and asked them about this phenomenon of trafficking and if they, had experienced it. And here is the fascinating part of this that I'm going to share with you. I haven't written it in an article yet, but a lot of the women said, oh, well, actually, all these people, you know, the US has spent millions of dollars trying to convince Highland people not to sell their women and daughters, which I guess is quite effective because no one was doing it then and they didn't get the idea to do it later. But when they got cell phones, this is so amazing. When they got cell phones, they said, oh no, when we got cell phones, it wasn't a problem anymore because it reduces the distance between what you don't know and what you know about where you're going. Think about traveling somewhere across the world. What is the first thing you do when you travel across a border or in a new place, right? You would call somebody. So without cell phones or without access to communication, and particularly in villages that only recently got electricity, they were unable to verify the whereabouts of their family members when they would travel outside of the village to go and work. So they're like, we solve our own problems. We get cell phones. We are able to check if the job is real and if they're safe, and we can check in on each other. But what's happened on the right here with this situation with Somali mom is that there is a kind of consumer desire to see and understand Asian women as particularly vulnerable or agencyless, right? It's a well-documented sort of fact in historical research and Orientalism, this idea that Asian women are agencyless. They're sort of the victims of a kind of misogyny, particular kinds of misogyny. And so Western organizations were funding Somali moms' work only on the stuff on sex trafficking and never really attending to the issues around risks for labor trafficking that also coexist with certain kinds of sexual exploitation. So eventually there's this kind of, you can follow this online, but there was a sort of expose that somehow she's lying, she's overplaying the role of sex trafficking in Cambodia and that she's a fraud. But I think what that tends to do is it downplays the way in which the West has been feeding on and circulating particular narratives about trafficking that meant the only way she could get funding was to simply tell that story and only that story all the time. I'm not saying it's a good idea to, frame a story in a particular way, but I think we also have to look at ourselves and how we consume particular kinds of stories. Okay, so what I'm saying, last point here, trafficking is a political ecological problem. This is from a reputable source. It's a map of it's ostensibly representing cases of human trafficking through I think it was the State Department's annual report on trafficking, and then it was relayed through the Atlantic. So these are at least they're fact checked at some level, and most of the data on this come from understandings of risk of trafficking as it is known through court cases and rescues, right? And I hope many of the eyebrows in the audience are like, that seems faulty. Your eyebrows should be going up because indeed it is still faulty, but nevertheless, right, this is sort of evidence-based. But what I want us to do here in thinking politically with a political ecological problem, right, is if we thought about this as a cultural problem, what we would do is look at this map and say, what are the cultural elements? How particular societies are culturally predisposed to exploit particular communities in their societies, right? Which is one take. Again, if you talk about it that way, the obligations for action look very differently than if we think about it as a political ecological problem. So a political ecological frame asks us to think slightly differently, well, perhaps entirely differently about the question, which is to say the political dimensions of trafficking. Who and what agents gain power through the movement of human beings coercively or deception across borders for the purpose of exploitation? It builds on a political economy framework, right? Kind of Marxist framework that also asks us to think about the economic conditions, right? How much capital is to be gained by this particular phenomenon? What agents gain that capital through the movement of people coercively or through deception across borders for the purpose of exploitation? But the ecological problem is a dimension that I encourage us all to think with. I'm finding extremely helpful in the sense that ecology, an ecology framework helps us think through not only the environmental dimensions, but how societies are embedded in particular kinds of environments. So if I go back to this, this is easiest to see in the fishing image. And this is particularly concerning in a context of climate change. So The reason we are seeing disproportionate cases of human trafficking in the Thai fishing industry in particular, right, is one of the key reasons is because of overfishing, right? So, and destructions of coastlines. So when fishing industries were local family businesses, a small boat goes out every day, they fish, they catch enough fish to feed themselves and sell at a local market. There's no political, economic, or ecological incentive to exploit somebody. The arrival of technologies that allow us to freeze fish and shrimp, ship them long distances, technologies that allow us to fish at greater capacity, long hauls, deep hauls for fish that pull extraordinary tons of fish. I have these images, right? That is connected very explicitly with the rise of exploitation of labor on these fishing boats. So as these larger commercial fishing boats have started kind of working the oceans, they're destroying more and more of the coastline. When you destroy more of the coastline, you have to go farther out the field to get your fish, which means you're on the boat for longer. And essentially, right, a fishing boat is the perfect place, just like perhaps for sex trafficking and you end up in a very clandestine space for the purpose of sexual exploitation, or in a factory in which people are not allowed, there are no windows, you can't see the labor. A fishing boat, the ecology, the political ecology of Thai fishing, or actually a lot of commercial fishing, it's not just entirely about the Thai industry, is such that people, to make the same amount of money, they're going farther out because there are fewer fish, coastlines are destroyed, and you will have people who end up on fishing boats, right, who think they're signing a contract for 1 month and they end up on fishing boats for years. And they're simply just getting supplies, food later, and they're promised wages, but they're not paid. So a political ecology framework also asks us to think about, right, not simply what kind of labor is being conducted, but under what environmental and political conditions. And I find it really useful because it helps us kind of unpack all of the dimensions of this. So all of this, right, is to help us ideally unthink some of the assumptions we have about how trafficking works and our potential role in stopping it. And I think in truth, right, if we think about risk of human trafficking as implicitly and explicitly linked to our relationship to labor, it begs the question, right, of who do we pay for particular kinds of work? Are we paying people under the table for domestic help, right? Domestic work in the United States, that particular industry, folks are disproportionately at risk of certain kinds of exploitation, trafficking perhaps, but certainly being underpaid, being not being paid on time, right? I'm not saying everybody in here is doing that, but I think the kind of question about thinking about our own position relative to how we pay people for certain kinds of labor, including the kinds of our choices as consumers, and understanding that these are political dimensions in which if the United States, right, which has disproportionate influence in a global economy, is working politically to undermine labor unions globally, our own labor unions, right, then we're undermining movements that have protected working conditions. Explicitly, it becomes a very political choice. So I think there are a lot of very well-meaning and highly profitable agencies that do, tours, you can travel and stop trafficking on your tours. I hate to sort of break people's bubbles, but they don't do it, right? They just, there's no way that we can act in this kind of savior mode to end an issue that is so structurally embedded in a global economy. I thought I was going 10 minutes. I went 19. I am excited to hear questions. I'm just going to pause. I know it's kind of an odd way to end, but I just realized how close I am to 5:50, and I want to make sure that I attend to questions if you have them, and address comments if you have them. And just again, want to thank you all for your time and attention, and hope it was remotely informative. What's a question, John? Oh, is that an invitation for questions, or do you have a question?
Oh, I think Bennett was first.
Oh, Bennett, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to seem critical, but
Oh, please.
you're what you're talking about is extremely naive.
Okay.
This has been like in front of us, and this this whole thing of the trafficking and the exploitation, and even worse, and I'll talk about that in a minute, is pushed by the people who have power in the world.
Right.
And if you don't know what the Epstein business was with Epstein Island and so forth and so on, I mean, that was trafficking for the purpose of basically blackmailing people. There's a case that came out of Brazil a couple of years ago. I put it in the chat, John of God. And if you're not familiar with that case, just Google John of God. He was running a baby farm where he would traffic women and keep them there, and they would produce babies, and the price was 40,000 euros per baby, and he would keep the women there until they died from the abuse. And the question is, where are these babies going? And that's another part of this whole thing, which is satanic murder. That's the price of the baby, and that human sacrifice has been part of human culture, for probably since the beginning. And this is just a modern version of it. I think people need to open their eyes. And this, being at the top, that the royal family in England was involved with this character, Jimmy Savile, who was a children's entertainer. And part of what he did was use his fame in that circumstance to have access to the children and traffic them to the power elite in England. And just one last thing here, in the U.S., you have various aspects of this, but a good summary of what happened in Omaha, it culminated in the 80s, is a book that someone wrote basically to save his life, which was expose everything so it doesn't gain him anything to kill him. And that's the book, The Franklin Cover-Up, that involves trafficking, in the child welfare system, involves corruption of the police, the courts, and also satanic murder. And so again, I'll repeat that, the Franklin Cover-Up. Google it. You can buy a copy. And if you really want to face this head on and not deny these things are going, what the worst of this is going on, because everything you're saying is going on, but there's like another layer of it that's even worse. And so I'll shut up.
Oh, I hope you don't shut up, Bennett. Actually, I really appreciate your comment. And I want to be clear again that I'm not saying that particularly egregious and horrifying forms of exploitation, trafficking, and in this case, outright murder don't exist. I'm not denying the existence of horrific acts on behalf of, one group and others. What I'm talking about is, and maybe wasn't quite as clear at the beginning, that the global political economy of development aid spends a huge amount of money on anti-trafficking work. It spends a ton of money without any real data, right? And broadly focuses on sex trafficking. And, if anybody ends up dead, if you're moving somebody to murder them, it is, I suppose it's well, no, it's not trafficking because it's not for the purpose of exploitation, it's for the purpose of murder. So it would fall in a different kind of legal category. But raising the question about, increasing risk. So for instance, if you're thinking about trafficking children and infants in a broader political economy of adoption, it's a huge problem. And it also, the point is not to say, I think what I'm asking us to think about is not simply about this problem in isolation. What we want to think about is, how has it come to pass, right? What are the historical and political and ecological layers over which, right, particular groups are at risk of losing their children through coercion or deception, right? And then where do those children go and who benefits politically, economically from that? And it's a problem, again, not because we need sufficient numbers to prove that it's a problem. I also want to be clear that anytime a child is exploited or murdered or trafficked, one is a problem enough for us to address it. The question is that so much of the effort and the money that goes into addressing these issues is totally misinformed about, oh, well, this is a cultural predispensation on behalf of particular groups that they don't love their children, so they'll have them and sell them, right? If you frame a problem in a particular way, then it obligates us to act in ways that actually don't address the problem. It addresses something else. Okay, I saw somebody answering another question. So I saw one up here in the, is there a reputable group to receive donations to address the issue of human trafficking? The Firecracker Foundation in East Lansing and Lansing, Michigan is doing extraordinary work in dealing with, for instance, the disproportionate risk that LGBTQIA youth and housing insecure youth are at risk of particular kinds of exploitation and trafficking. They do ethnographically informed work both in preventing human trafficking and trafficking kind of rescue work. So typically, right, if a lot of the work that was being done in the 90s and early 2000s, and even in many places, was like, what we need is better policing. Well, it sounds really great, except that police are often implicated in moving people across borders. They can't move easily across borders in million-dollar trafficking rings without particular communities of police being directly involved in either the movement of people or exploitation. So funding police in particular places can actually make the problem worse. It's just it's understanding a problem in context. I just made a plug for the Firecracker Foundation. I have others if you're interested in that, but I'll go ahead. I can save at the end and answer more. What other questions might you have?
There's a question from iPhone. I don't know who is logged in with iPhone.
That's okay. What's the question? We have iPad 51 and iPhone.
Let's see if they are still with us. All right. In the meantime, we're going to move on to Dr. Waller, who I believe has a question.
Thanks, Amanda. That was a really helpful corrective. I've got a question about the future of trafficking, and I'm thinking particularly of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is going to open up so much of the world and make it so much easier, I'm assuming, for once fairly remote communities to be able to move to large factory complexes. Mm-hmm. Is there an expectation that the kind of labor trafficking that dominates this area is going to be escalated by the Belt and Road plans?
Yeah, in fact, UN agencies are already moving to preempt both the desire, right? If people can see, particularly like what we have to understand is in a context of diminishing resources, being diminished because of when people are residing in forests, like the communities where I work, certain degrees of population growth are sustainable, but there's diminished resources, and the state is also reducing and limiting access to resources. The same is happening in Laos, Cambodia, et cetera, where this Belt Road Initiative moves. So people, when they have the opportunity to move to find a job that they could gain money and send it home, right? Because of cultural obligations of caring for family members, et cetera, they want to do that. And there have been efforts, UN efforts to try to just encourage people not to leave. It's not working. But there's also ethnographically informed initiatives to say, for instance, the ISRA Institute, which I worked with in the research on the fishing boat trafficking work. So they've started producing apps, mobile apps in Burmese, Lao, Khmer, Thai for migrant workers to use, where they can share information amongst themselves about this labor recruiter is a scam artist, or this person, because really cell phones and the opportunity for instead of agencies to come from the outside and say, don't do this, do that, or, you know, teach about something they don't fully understand because it's so fluid, mobile phones are proving to be, I don't want to overstate the potential for this, but they are in many instances actually helping people figure out which communities or recruiters and employers to avoid in a range of industries. And that's quite incredible. But it also, right, while in Southeast Asia, people have phones, they've got extraordinary phones. In villages where there's barely any electricity, a lot of the villagers used to laugh at me and my husband because they were like, my family has cooler phones than you. They have these amazing phones because of where they're located in proximity to the production of those phones. So that's a particularly amazing resource, but I don't know how the extent to which that same solution would work outside of Southeast Asia, or outside, you know, where people maybe have less robust access to the technology or the networks. But even in our research, we were asking people, do they take their phones on the boats? The answer was yes. So it was like, well, why aren't we using phones? It's an incredible way to collapse that distance of not knowing. Thank you, Susan, on retweeting this firecracker promotion. They're doing incredible work. And your point about nurses intervening, right? This is also a political ecological framework of understanding where people at risk might show up. So instead of in Southeast Asia in particular, when people were funding police, when the US government and bilateral agencies were funding the Thai police or the Cambodian police, it wasn't simply that police are trafficking people or that certain corrupt police were involved in facilitating it. It was that police, you know, we see a problem in a particular way on the basis of our expertise. So there would be this a raid solution. You find a place where questionable sex work is, and I say questionable because it's not, I also don't want to denigrate all forms of sex work. There are people doing sex work that I know who have great dignity in their work. That's a different talk for a different time. But for people, you know, in contexts where a police force might do a raid, everybody looks like a criminal, right? So then people who are supposed to be treated as potential victims, or they need some kind of restorative care, and they don't even know perhaps that they've been victims to a trafficking ring or exploited, they get thrown in jail. So that's the kind of solution. So thinking about nurses as a point of intervention is informed by the particular kind of political economy in which people at risk might meet with someone who could intervene on their behalf. Joel and Kathy Hoffman, hi. How many ethnic groups does Thailand have? Do all minority ethnic groups lack citizenship? Yeah, so Joel and Kathy, you are well informed. It depends on how they're defining ethnic group, but the most recent statement by the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, which is a coalition of indigenous and highland communities across all of Asia, they count over 40 in Thailand on the basis of kind of cultural, religious, and linguistic practices or dialects. So it's extremely diverse, but that diversity is not in the rest of Southeast Asia, right? Burma, Laos, in particular, the national majority is actually a minority. In Thailand, 90% of the population or more is ethnically Thai, broadly defined. So this incredible diversity of indigenous and ethnic minority communities is a very small proportion of the overall population, which also means the demography of the country means that their particular struggles are not always at the center of national concern. But in Laos, the Lao national group that's for which the country is named actually constitutes a minority and that smaller ethnic groups, right, as a community constitute a vast majority. And this question about citizenship is so good. So citizenship is, I really came to questions of citizenship thinking about it in a very kind of conventional kind of political framework and a very Western framework. We have it or we don't have it. And the more I spent time with indigenous people in Thailand, they were like, we have our own kinds of citizenship, our ways of belonging and ways of duties and obligations to society. But it's really the question about who has recognition or doesn't have recognition is tied to a national history of civil unrest in Southeast Asia, particularly in the 20th century with Vietnam War, Laos Civil War, Cambodian wars, and Thailand's particular space in those interventions. And so Highland people don't have citizenship, not simply because Thais discriminate against them and think of them as sort of backwards people, but they also, it's a way of dispossessing people of critical resources. So we find increasingly, as I've been thinking about citizenship in relationship to natural resources, finding that groups that occupy spaces of some of the last remaining first growth forests, spaces, critical watersheds, they are at particular risk of being denied their citizenship because it's a very effective way of ensuring that state or private entities are able to take land. If you recognize somebody with citizenship, often that entails their rights to private property because it's framed in a very, that's not everywhere, but citizenship as it's framed in Southeast Asia is based on a Western model. So that's how I've started moving a lot of my work on and towards the connection between citizenship, labor, and ecology.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Flaim at this time?
Well, I just want to say that it is a real honor. I don't take for granted that anybody just wants to sit around and hear me talk about my work. So the fact that all 34 of you have sat through this and are chewing on it, whether it provoked you or you feel that you've learned something, I am honored to have your attention. And I'm hopeful that at some point I'll get to meet you in person, and wish you all continued good health and safety and surrounded by the people that matter to you. And Marianne and John, thank you again for making this happen and making space for me. So thank you so much, everybody. I'll stick around if anybody was feeling shy, but yeah, go enjoy your evenings. And don't eat Thai shrimp.
That was fabulous. Thank you so much, Amanda.
No worries. Thanks,
really
John.
Informative. Does anybody have it? We do have a few more minutes if anybody has another question. They want to put it in the chat box or shout out.
We're all swimming.
Yeah.
No worries. Please don't feel like you're obligated. Yeah, and feel free to contact me. I'll just, if anybody wants to follow up for anything else, I'll just put my email in here and you're welcome to connect with me at any time.
Super. Okay. Well, many thanks again, Amanda and Chris. Please, everybody, do endeavor to return this time next week, where our speaker is Dr. Steph Schuster, who is at Lyman Briggs College and also the Department of Sociology, and is the author of a book that came out, I think about 2 months ago. I just received my copy, Trans Medicine, the Emergence and Practice of Treating Gender. There's going to be another really interesting talk.
It's a super groundbreaking bit of work, and we're so lucky at MSU to have Steph here. So I regardless of what you think of my work, I'm going to give a big thumbs up. Everybody make sure you make time for Steph. They're an incredible scholar. So I'm actually going to try to make it too, if there's space for me.
Of course. Okay. Well, thank you, and hope to see you all next week.